Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ted Wells. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at STEMconnector. I'm joined here by our CEO, Edie Fraser.
Hi, is Ted, thank you. I think a special shout out to ASTC. And clearly, we can tell you we believe that the ASTC is the best kept secret across the country and across the world. And is to Bud Rock and your team there, we thank you. Ted, I just want to thank you for setting up the call. But you have said in your brochure that you put the wow in STEM, and we absolutely concur. Between getting 100 million visitors in all the science and technology centers in the U.S. around the world, the exhibits, the online learning, and the innovative programs that you're reaching these millions and millions of family and kids for the future, and with the latest of technology. We just want to thank you, Bud, thank Kathy, and Ted and I want to say you are a tremendous partner. When the White House Department of Education heard that we were doing this town hall, they say the science centers are the learning centers of this country and the world. Thank you, Bud. Thank you, ASTC. Thank you, Ted Wells.
Thanks, Edie. Just a 1 second before I introduce you to our first speaker today, I'd like to the Association for Science and Technology Centers and its member associations are critical to the STEM movement that's thriving nationally. Science centers represent a critical resource for students to learn, explore, and engage, and adults. We are thrilled to have our partnership with ASTC, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to their CEO, Anthony Bud Rock, who will take you through this dynamic town hall. Founded in 1973, ASTC now numbers nearly 600 members in over 40 countries. Members include not only science centers and museums, but also nature centers, aquariums, planetariums, zoos, botanical gardens, and natural history and children's museums, as well as companies. Bud Rock, their CEO, will take you through a more in-depth look at ASTC, but he joined as their president in 2009 after serving at Arizona State, where he was responsible for expanding global awareness among ASU students and developing new and creative international programs of research and scholarships at one of the largest and most progressive universities in the United States, and also a good partner of ours. Prior to joining ASU, Rock had a distinguished 3-decade career in U.S. government service, much of it with the Department of State, promoting scientific and technological collaboration throughout the world. He completed stints in Washington that focused on trade, technology, and the environment, among other things. And he also completed overseas assignments in places like Israel, Belgium, and France. So he certainly, as the curator of the museums across the country, seems like he's got the right track record. So, Bud, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for our partnership, and we look forward to hearing from your members today.
Great, Ted. Thank you so much, and thanks to Edie as well for the opening remarks. And we are delighted as the representative of the Science Center and Museum community to have a chance to speak a little bit today about our activities in STEM. We're going to be running a few PowerPoint slides here as well. Ted, I think you're controlling that. So if we're on my first slide, refers very quickly to what we are as an organization. We are a global organization that provides what we like to say is collective voice as well as professional support for science centers and museums and related institutions, all of whom have innovative approaches to science learning, inspiring people of all ages about the wonders and the meaning of science in their lives. The next slide is a general breakdown of our science and museums and related institutions. I think what's important to show here is that while many of our institutions define themselves as specifically science or science centers or science and technology museums, we also include a wide collection of institutions of museum nature or visitor center or specialized institutions, all of whom include science literacy as their primary area of interest. The next slide. I think Ted referred to the fact that our institution is a global organization, and as such, we are located, our 650 members now are located in roughly 50 countries around the world. So we are actively engaged in the concept of STEM literacy. We also look at science from a truly global perspective. The next slide. When we consider what science centers and museums do in the world today, I think what's really important is that we be viewed as relevant, as innovative, and as inspirational. Our job, our science centers and museums see that they are strengthening the environment for learning and for applying science, and more we are attempting to engage the public in issues where science understanding is absolutely essential. Next slide. It won't come as any surprise, I think, to those listening that the science centers that exist in communities all over the United States, in all 50 states, in fact, are engaged heavily in school-related programs. And more than 90% of our science centers offer specific school outreach activities. It may be a little bit surprising, however, that more than 80% are doing teacher professional development, that almost 75% are actually working on the curriculum materials in the school systems, that more than 60% have special programs for homeschoolers, or that 40% are actually offering youth employment programs in the science centers themselves. It's a diverse community with diverse activities, all related to STEM literacy and public engagement in science. Next slide. So Edie was gracious enough to place our numbers at about 100 million visitors per year. We're gonna hold that number at about 95, but we're working toward that 100 million number. But it's a large number of visits per year, and I would emphasize that in that, school attendance alone, school groups represent about 25 million of that number in any given year. Our science centers and museums vary greatly in size and in scale. One interesting aspect of them is that about 80% of them are private, nonprofit institutions. They are very tied to their communities, and they are driven very strongly by community interests. Next slide. A statement that we hear over and over again, and it has been referred to periodically in the National Science Foundation's Science and Engineering Indicators document, is that Americans consistently endorse both the past achievements and the future promise of science and technology. I will point out that what is not included in this slide is that very often Americans who value science can't actually go to the details and understand many of the aspects of science in their day-to-day lives, but they know instinctively that it is an area in which the promise of our nation rests in the achievements that we make in the science and technology domain. Next slide. It's important, however, that when we hear over and over and over again about the OECD scoring and the ranking of countries among with respect to science test scores, that these test scores and these measurements are not in themselves measuring what we might call scientific curiosity. And what studies are showing us is that many countries that rank the highest in terms of those PISA test scores and the science score rankings rank among the lowest regarding an actual interest in science. That having an interest in science, that being inspired by science, is a huge driver toward the actual engagement in science, both from a career point of view and from a sheer understanding in terms of the public's willingness to grasp the science issues that affect their lives. Next slide. Two excellent examples of this are two studies that have pointed to the value of inspiration. One study indicates that 8th grade students who have shown an interest in science and in science careers are 3 times more likely to pursue a college degree in sciences than those who just simply score high on standardized tests, but don't show that interest by roughly 8th grade. And 60, a separate survey, more than 60% of the scientists who were surveyed said that they actually started their interest in science by age 11, and that those informal science experiences, the science experiences that occur outside the classroom, were as positive, and in many cases more positive, than the experiences that happen in the schools themselves. Next slide. So the point that I think we will hear over and over again, and should be repeated as we go through our discussions today about informal science learning and about the role of science centers and museums, is that the time spent on science and math classes makes up less than 1% of a person's waking hours. In contrast, adults report that they use all manner of informal science education and experiences with science to improve their lifelong learning. And that lifelong learning is derived not only from the importance of understanding science in their lives, but it focuses on their careers, it focuses on their decisions that they make, and their willingness to understand what policy officials tell them about decisions that are being made for society in science. Our science centers help to engage the public, those 95 million visitors, in understanding those issues, in those complex issues, in a very comprehensible fashion. So with that as a general overview, I wanted to turn to our speakers today to focus on particular aspects of how the science centers can help to advance this agenda, and how what they represent within their communities. And I wanted to start this discussion with Bryce Seidel, who is the CEO of the Pacific Science Center in Seattle, Washington. And Bryce is going to speak to us a little bit about how science centers really serve as community anchors for a range of topics, not just science literacy, but a range of activities within the community itself. And Bryce, I'm going to ask you, as I will ask everyone, to remember to unmute your mic as you go on the screen, so folks will hear you. Bryce, let me turn to you.
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. It's my pleasure to speak to you from Seattle, Washington this morning. Science centers exist in many sizes and forms around the world. You heard some statistics about our association. Some are really simple organizations, and some are quite large and complex. But despite the great differences in our institutions one from another, we really serve in almost all places as what one can refer to as a community anchor. I want to expand a little bit as I start this out in terms of at least what I think of as being a community anchor. I think of community anchors as being institutions that are held really in high regard, that are considered to be part of the core community where they reside. Science centers usually meet these criteria. Community anchors are often seen as part of culture, just worthy of respect. They're almost always a destination within their communities for local people as well as for people who are coming in as visitors. Community anchors are always safe places, places that people are comfortable in. Usually community anchors are places where there is a social component, a social dimension to them. They're not monolithic and foreboding, but they're welcoming places for people. Often institutions that are contributors to education and to educational outcomes are viewed as community anchors. They're viewed as important and sometimes as cherished places. Now, a little later on, my colleagues that follow me are all going to talk, I'm sure, articulately about a variety of elements of the work that science centers do. And I hope with the additional comments I'm going to make that I'll just set the stage for them. We science centers really are unique in form compared to most classic museums and cultural organizations. Our fundamental role is inspiration, as Bud so well pointed out, through engagement and discovery, not as repositories of history and artifacts as being our defining characteristic. We're places to discover science, and we're also a place where people discover a lot about themselves. Well, going through with the freedom to explore, people unlock interests they didn't know they had, and find out how curious they really are. We stand separate from others in that the stories we tell are rooted in the past in the form of science fundamentals, but also in the present through the way we talk about current science. And we're also out in the future in terms of the discovery, invention, and innovation that is stimulated and occurs here and elsewhere. I think more than any other institutions, we're considered safe places. We're safe in every way. We're certainly a place that's viewed as being safe for kids, safe for families, and safe for ideas. A safe place for dangerous ideas, as one of my directors likes to say. We're seen in a lot of different ways when people are asked to describe their science center. Some think of us first as educational institutions. Some think of us simply as a wonderful place for a family to be together. Some see us as providers and supporters of professional development for educators, of which we are. Some see us as a central facility, hosting activities they can attend, while others see us mainly through outreach programs. They're not familiar with our facilities, but see us out in our communities and sometimes large distances from our home base. Others think of us as leaders of educational reform. Some see us centers for lectures and seminars and other programming about science and society, places where they can better understand how science is touching their lives and what current science means to them. Some segments of our community recognize us as economic drivers from our basic activities, and for some science centers, as a result of the major blockbuster exhibitions that we occasionally are able to host. In our case in Seattle, when we hosted King Tut, the economic impact on our city and region was more than $70 million, according to a University of Washington economics researcher. Some see us just as places, and I shouldn't say just, see us as places for wonderful camps for kids. So we have many faces. We vary by community, we vary by scale, and we vary by programming. But everywhere we're held with very high levels of trust. In a moment, Matt Fleury is going to talk to us specifically about educational partnerships. Given that we're considered community anchors to some degree based on our roles in education, I want to add just a comment or two as a preface to Matt. Certainly there's a huge interest in STEM education for a wide variety of reasons. At the high level, most governments understand that we are in an international playfield, competing in an international economy where jobs that depend upon science and technology are of the utmost importance. Engineering and math are foundational to life skills. More locally, some look to us actually to try to improve test scores and demonstrate that we are in fact adding people to the STEM workforce pipeline. That latter is something that's an inevitable consequence by our existence and by our inspiration of young people and provision of supportive environments for kids that want to pursue STEM careers, or by virtue of being with us, decide they want to pursue STEM careers. But we suffer to a degree that I think particularly corporate donors fail to understand this role of being important catalysts that result in a heightened interest and inspiration in science, which is critical but not often recognized as a prerequisite for choosing a path of study and career. The study that Bud Rock cited in his opening comments is very important and insightful in terms of how fundamentally important it is for people to, at a young age, imagine themselves in a STEM career. Nobody chooses to pursue a career simply because they got a high test score. They pursue careers that they're interested in. But there is no question we're part of the STEM education ecosystem. Think about the next generation science standards coming up. NGSS is seen as a challenge for formal education. We have the powerful potential to make this easier for formal education. What we do every day is what's missing in the classrooms from the next generation science standards, the practices of science and engineering. We have a huge reservoir of capacity and experience in bringing this element forward as we collectively work for furthering education. Community anchors are generally considered beloved places. Science centers that have been around for a while certainly play that role. Very few places not only allow but invite exuberant activity on their floors, exuberant engagement. Few invite pushing buttons, pulling levers, manipulating devices in free form without direction. Where else can people test their understanding of concepts like evolution without inviting heated debate, but rather getting in return offers of data and evidence that invite personal examination and personal understanding? Where else can students go to explore their curiosity without any implications of competition, without implications of testing, without implications of grading? These attributes help make us a beloved place that's felt safe and comfortable. We're also apolitical. We're generally not victims of partisan political bickering. Generally, we have no agenda that can be politicized within our walls, although certainly some politicians in today's world try to hijack science for driving their own agendas. So generally, we are embraced by communities large and small. As economic drivers, as educational centers, and places for recreation and learning, science centers have fundamentally attractive attributes for a community. Certainly in the U.S., we have a critical challenge to maintain and boost public confidence in science and scientific research. The decisions made in Washington, D.C., whether or not to fund NSF, NASA, NOAA, NIH, and others, those are not scientific decisions. Those are political decisions. To the extent that the general voting public becomes disenchanted with science, our representatives in D.C. deciding how to vote the public treasury will lose confidence. So, with massive research in health and other sciences being one of the bedrock foundational contributions of the United States to the world, it's really important that public confidence be maintained. The science centers help play that role. We build support for the family unit, and the school unit for science is important for kids in society. Places that don't yet have science centers want them. Places that have had them and have lost them want them back. I think about the tragic loss of the Science Center in Italy by fire, and the loss of Science Alive in Christchurch, New Zealand, with their massive earthquake a couple of years ago. In Christchurch, the reconstruction in a prominent place is a high priority for the community. Given the demographics of our audiences, we're attractive places for the engagement of individuals and corporations who believe that raising the access to and interest in science in students and the general population is important. Certainly those that are interested in raising the general level of science literacy, civic science literacy, value science centers also. So for all those reasons, we really stand in a generally pretty special place in our communities as beloved institutions that are considered anchors to part of the educational infrastructure as well as the social and cultural infrastructure of their communities. Well, thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of my colleagues.
Bryce, thanks so much. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate the fact that you have highlighted the role that we play in communities, not only as an entity that can coalesce interests, that can bring interests together at our locations, but we exist well beyond our four walls. We've done a wonderful job helping bring the STEM education community toward us so that the dialogue can exist in an objective platform like a science center, but we also are deeply in our communities beyond our four walls, doing programming as far as our possibilities can take us. So thanks for all of those points. There was reference in Bryce's remarks and in mine as well to our relationships to the formal education community. And I wanted to turn just a little bit to speak in a little bit more detail about those formal ed partnerships. And I'd like to turn to Matt Fleury, who is the president and CEO of the Connecticut Science Center in Hartford, Connecticut, to say a few words about science centers and formal education partnerships. Matt?
Thank you, Bud, and thank you, Bryce. I'm happy to do that. I hope you can hear me, and I apologize for the Vin Scully headgear here, which is an homage in part to the fact that here in Connecticut we're the proud home of ESPN and NBC Sports, and of course recently the two champions of the NCAA basketball season.
Oh, that's right.
Don't ask me to call a game, but it sort of looks like I might. Bryce provided such a wonderful overview of the things we do in our communities, and I'll attempt to build on that in the respects that Bud suggested. You can put up my first slide here if you like, and if you are putting it up, I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to just roll along here. So after introducing myself, which I think the first slide essentially does, we'll move to the next one. What I wanted to talk about here is how we contribute to the goals of the formal ed system. And we do that in a number of ways that were overviewed really beautifully by Bryce. So the next slide, please. We're talking about our service to schools directly. We are going to remark in some specifics about that. And really the very, very deeply and inherently related service to the outcomes for which schools are held accountable that we provide to students and their families directly outside of school, and then through our service directly to teachers so that they can be more effective in the classroom. So I want to just urge everybody on the call, if you haven't seen it, to take a look at a 2010 paper by two of the preeminent researchers on program evaluation in our field, John Falk and Lynn Dierking, called the 95% Solution. And because they have documented everything that I'm going to say in much greater depth than I could here, I just really encourage everyone interested in this discussion to reflect on that paper, which is available, I think, online quite readily. It was in the American Scientist magazine. Again, 2010, Falk and Dierking. They make the point, as Bud and Bryce have, that a great deal of a person's learning life really occurs outside of a classroom, 95%, hence the term and the title of their paper, the 95% solution. And it's just to punctuate the fact that learning happens throughout life, for better or worse. And while we double down so heavily and necessarily on what happens inside a classroom, much less a science classroom, it really is important to recognize the tremendous potential of better leveraging non-school learning experiences as part of a comprehensive approach to learning that we as science centers believe very much in. And I think it's perhaps not as widely understood as it might be. I think there was reference to a study about a performance gap study that was done in Baltimore, in which they found that students who were advantaged and disadvantaged came out of the school year really very comparably in terms of their achievement and their standing as students. But as soon as they went home for the summer, the bottom for the disadvantaged kids dropped out. And that obviously is a dreadful thing, and many of the people on the call have an appreciation for some of the reasons for that. And they reflect many socioeconomic challenges that we have. But it points to the fact that it's not all about what happens in the classroom. And for those kids to come back after the school year and be so dreadfully far apart in their readiness to kind of go to the next level of learning in the curriculum, as opposed to having to catch up with the disadvantaged kids, is a challenge that we as a society confront, and which also punctuates the great value, need, and importance for non-school learning environments, of which museums, of course, are one. We hold among the finer opportunities that exist, but certainly not the only ones. So we know that out-of-school learning is vital to in-school achievement, and must go after that as a strategy to advance in-school learning. We can look at the next slide now. So in-school learning, as is provided through the traditional field trip at science centers, so we're having class time at a science center by virtue of field trip, is a very big part of the life of most museums and science centers. And increasingly, schoolhouse demands on time and dollars compete with these field trips, as does the image of a traditional field trip, hard to quantify in an increasingly performance-oriented educational environment. And science centers, it turns out, often stand up to these tests relatively well due to the careful focus that our institutions have on school curricular standards and requirements, so that a day at the science center is less a blow-off steam run around. We have our share of that, we all acknowledge it. But that very often they're much more focused field trips. And for example, here in Connecticut, as an only 5-year-old institution, we had the opportunity to create our exhibits and programs around the Connecticut State Science Standards, now being retooled toward the next generation science standards, so that we offer literally a menu for teachers so they can shop in our education guide, so they could see Connecticut Standards, grade 6, strand 2, abiotic factors. How do soil porosity and permeability affect water transport and plant growth, and decide that that's appropriate to what they're trying to achieve in the classroom, and therefore this field trip has a better case to make for itself as a use of classroom time and dollars. And that's one example of what many, many science centers are doing very effectively. And increasingly with the STEM focus, that's an important attribute for us. On the next slide, I want to talk a little about in-school, at-school work that science centers are involved with. And this is our outreach programs, and as Bryce mentioned, we are in many, many schools. In fact, the Pacific Science Center has one of the largest such programs, working at a tremendous scale with schools around Washington State and perhaps beyond. Another one I like to point to is the Maryland Science Center, where the state of Maryland, in fact, funds through the state budget the provision of outreach programs as well as field trips, but I focus here on the outreach programs by the Maryland Science Center in schools throughout the state of Maryland. so that they can have these experiences. So indeed, the state government in Maryland has decided this is a strategic use of taxpayer dollars in aid of the educational goals of the state of Maryland. So with an increasing emphasis on STEM, science centers are one of the best ways to quickly and affordably actually add STEM to classrooms on an outbound basis as those classrooms attempt to catch up with the changes in science curriculum and the focus on STEM. We could go to the next slide here. I wanted to talk in particular about our work through teachers. And as a scarcely 5-year-old institution here in Hartford, I want to emphasize, learned much from our partners in the field, many of those represented here, about how to provide service through teachers. And one of the unique experiences we had before we opened was the opportunity here to serve teachers before we even had a building to which we could invite their students as a way to start to work to advance our educational, science education mission. So while kids, as we discussed, spend relatively a small portion of their learning time in school, we invest so much in that and clearly are so invested in that it's important that we all work together to make sure that time is optimized. As obviously a teacher reaches 50-odd kids a day, the exponential benefit of a more potent and capable science teacher really cannot be overestimated. As Bud said, more than 80% of science centers are doing professional development, a major resource, especially for in-service teachers around the country. The Boston Museum of Science runs the National Center for Technological Literacy, which includes the Engineering as Elementary program. We're the Connecticut provider of that, an extraordinary program to get younger kids involved in engineering that's really being rolled out around the country. I mentioned Pacific Science Center. Their laser program serves a huge percentage of schools in Washington State, 100,000 plus educators since they started in 1999. The Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, incidentally, just published a new study that was done by a third party about the impact of their professional development work with teachers in Illinois. And here we opened the Mandel Academy for Teachers, which is serving 1,000 teachers a year in professional development, focused on STEM, but also on learning techniques, particularly focused on the inquiry method, so that science centers have incredible reach. And these teacher training programs really represent an enormous opportunity to strengthen teaching across the country. I emphasize that much of that opportunity is created locally by donors, by corporate sponsors, by local governments, and therefore schools can have access to these, even though they might pay something for them, as ours do, at really a relatively affordable price compared to the cost of actually providing those services. And lastly, I want to point to something in the next slide, which is something we're really excited about as an innovation here at our institution, again inspired by the work of others, which is what we refer to as a comprehensive model. The bundling of all of the services I just described in an intensive partnership with a school or a school district. We've done this on a school-by-school basis to date. The professional development, the coaching after the professional development, the student experiences at science centers as well as in schools, and the combination of that with family experiences to really create a culture around STEM and learning in a school. And we've had the opportunity to work with multiple schools over the past few years and track their test results on Connecticut mastery tests. And we have seen really the exciting potential of this, and our ambition, and I think many in the field see the potential to take this to a larger scale in aid of really measurable advances in student performance in STEM fields in particular. This model produced very impressive results for us. For example, we had a school here in Hartford that started well below the state average in 5th grade mastery science results, and after 3 years, by virtue of the good work of the school itself and the inputs of the Science Center as a really intensive, comprehensive partner here, are now competing at and above the Connecticut state average, which is one of the better averages in the country. So reform-minded schools and often donors will pay for these services, and it's a really nice response to the imperative that schools have for the injection of new resources, new intellectual resources, new approaches, and sometimes just a culture reset as they try to turn around a troubled school. A multifaceted partnership between a school and a science center drives all the things you would expect: enthusiasm, interest, inspiration, but ultimately results. Results you can actually measure on a test, as well as in terms of inspiration and interest levels, which Bud articulated as being so important as well. We can't know whether the improved test scores or the cultural attitude change will ultimately be more important for a student, but we know all of this is important to the things we as educators strive for day after day. So we're looking at this as a way in which we can really amplify, elevate the interrelationship, the partnership between the formal ed system, schools and school districts, and the informal part of the equation, which we represent as science centers. With that, I defer to you, Bud, and the rest of my colleagues, and thank you for the time.
Matt, thank you very much for your comments. It's great to see that reference to the fact that while so many people in our community may be aware of a science center as a place with some amazing exhibits and an approach to science learning that requires movement from location to location, the fact is that so much is going on behind those exhibits in terms of programming, particularly that which is connected to our school systems and helping our teacher professional development. That is a much larger component in many ways of what we are for our communities. We keep referring over and over again to the importance of inspiration, the importance of creativity, the importance of innovation, and I wanted to turn on to delve a little bit more deeply into that aspect and talk about science centers as drivers of creativity and innovation, and invite Paul Fontaine, who is the Vice President of Education at the Museum of Science in Boston, to comment on this issue of creativity and innovation in more detail. Paul?
Well, hello everyone. Greetings from Boston, from the home of the world champion Boston Red Sox, except for last night. I want to talk a little bit about the unique attribute of science centers and how creativity and innovation is integral to the fabric of what we do. Right now in the local science center in your community, it's a laboratory. Places are inventing themselves if they're new, or reinventing themselves if they're established. Let's go to the first slide. The founding director of the Museum of Science, Brad Washburn, had a saying, which was, you don't have to do the wrong thing to become irrelevant in your community. You just need to do the same thing for far too long. Science centers are featured prominently in the fabric of STEM organizations in your community. Let's go to the next slide. You know, there's familiar aspects of science centers. You're all familiar with them. The family trip during school vacation week, the field trip that Matt just talked about. These are family learning environments, collaborative learning that takes place at many levels for the entire family. They're fun places. Nothing says Halloween like blowing up a pumpkin in Chicago. But they're also places where we're creating new models for STEM education. The fellow down at the bottom is part of a Nano Days event that's taking place at over 200 science centers across the country. A major program funded by the NSF in 2 5-year cycles. The Nanoscale Informal Science Education Network is an opportunity to tell a new science to a growing population where nanotechnology touches so many parts of our lives. Let's go to the next slide. Over the next few minutes, I want to give you 3 examples of collaborations between science centers and their communities. The Museum of Science is involved in each of these to show how we're introducing engineering into science centers and schools. You know, our director, Yanis Mialis, says that for many years, STEM really meant SM, science and math. But science centers are rapidly becoming experts at introducing and teaching technology and engineering in both schools and in their science centers. And one is an innovative program funded by the NSF that brings current science research directly to our visitors and engages visitors across the country in real, authentic science research. Next slide. Science centers have a long history of developing STEM materials for use in formal education. One of the best examples of that are our friends and colleagues at the Lawrence Hall of Science in Berkeley. Their fantastic FOSS programs and GEM curriculums have been used for decades to teach science and math in a hands-on, interactive way. In 2001, the Museum of Science entered into a curriculum development phase, and as Matt pointed out, one of the products from our National Center of Technological Literacy is our Engineering is Elementary program. This program brings students in direct touch with engineering activities in their classroom. We developed a series of 20 storybooks, each one that tells the story of a student from around the world who faces an engineering problem, and a friend or relative who's an engineer helps them craft a solution. Students create solutions in a hand-on way. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the students engaging in curriculum in their schools, it looks a lot like a science center. There's materials, there's experiments that are going on that are open-ended, and there's the opportunity for failure that allows them to refine their program and learn about the engineering design process. We couldn't do this program alone. Corporate friends like Raytheon Corporation, Cognizant, Millipore, Liberty Mutual, and Bechtel have all helped the Museum of Science and other science centers introduce this program into their schools. The next slide, though, shows the power of collaboration. Our colleagues in Arizona, Connecticut, Matt's team is now one of the Science Center providers. Science Museum of Minnesota, the Tech Museum, they're all engaging in teacher professional development that allow their communities and their teachers to begin to introduce engineering into their classrooms. It's critical now that the next generation science standards have engineering practices and content integral to what students are learning in their classroom. And the beauty of these curricula are that they are multidisciplinary. We can use them in language arts, we can use them in science, we can use them in math. And it wouldn't be possible without our friends in the corporate arena and our colleagues at science centers around the world. We've now reaching over 1 million new students each year in curriculum development. So when you look at Lawrence Hall, when you look at our friends at the Exploratorium, the Museum of Science, creating products for use in the classroom is one of the most interesting areas of innovation going on today. But let's get back to that exhibit hall experience that we're creating. If you go to the next slide, you'll see a scene that's replicated in science centers around the country. This is an area where we're introducing engineering and engineering design into the Science Center experience. Many folks across the country, in Indiana, California, Minnesota, Exploratorium, they are doing their own variations of introducing engineering activities onto their exhibit floors. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that folks are engaging in an opportunity to introduce folks to the engineering design process. You know, most of the world that we interact with is the human-made world. And how does that come about? Well, we have a challenge, a goal we want to reach. We ask a question, consider how we might solve it, plan and prototype a solution, make it, refine it, and figure out how we can improve it. This engineering design process is one that science centers around the country are introducing their visitors in new and novel ways. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that many science centers have a dedicated area within their museum where students, families, adults can engage in engineering activities. They're materials-based, there's large-scale testing devices, and interestingly enough, they encourage extended explorations. Anybody who's been to a science center knows that much of the fatigue comes from going from station to station to station. But engineering activities across the country are engaging people for 20, 30, 45 minutes and over an hour. That's really unheard of, and a sense of real pride for institutions to be able to engage people in extended periods of time with this new innovative content. The next slide shows the result, what we're trying to do. As Bud said, our job is to inspire. We want to increase the number of young people who are introduced to engineering so it's on their radar. An interesting study points to 80% of today's engineers were inspired in engineering by a family member or a friend who was an engineer. If you don't have an engineer in the family, it's not on your radar. So science centers around the country are bringing this important topic to families in a new way. The last example that I want to talk about in the next slide shows it brings authentic research into science centers. There's a collaborative across the country funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Living Lab Partnership. It's a collection of 4 major partners and dozens of smaller partners who are working with their university researchers. Here in Boston, we're working with Boston University, Harvard, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to bring cognitive development researchers, social scientists, neuroscientists into science centers to have them do their research with our visitors. It's not market research, which is equally important and done in some of our colleague institutions. It's not the Pepsi Coke challenge that we're bringing, but it's actually current research that's going on. Questions are being asked like, can you read someone's mind by looking at their face? Can children learn about natural selection through picture storybooks? Or how do children learn to recognize new facial expressions and connect that to their emotions? These are complex and deep questions. And one of the exciting things about this research, and one of the reasons NSF cited supporting it and creating this national collaborative, was that it brought researchers and scientists in direct contact with museum science center visitors. Parents can talk to researchers about childhood development. Researchers can talk to parents about these new questions that are being developed. The fields are developing rapidly. Many of our partners are expanding this research into fields like biology or robotics. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that this is a national collaborative, and there's likely an institution in your community where this work could take place. Our friends in Portland, Oregon, Madison, Wisconsin, Maryland, Baltimore, funded by the NSF, are working together with dozens of other partners around the country to bring this work to fore. So I encourage you to learn more about these by talking with one of these partners in your region. The last slide really talks about museums as familiar organizations. In many ways, in many communities, our science centers are like a comfortable shoe. We want to reiterate that right now your science center is likely inventing a new approach to science education. It's got some new collaborative going on with partners in your community, and it's inventing a new way to bring STEM and reinvent STEM approach to education. I encourage you to talk to your science centers and learn more about what's going on and how you can get involved. Thanks, Bud.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for that that overview. I know it's interesting because we talk a lot about the scientific method, hypothesis testing, and you've pointed to examples of that. And what we've learned over the years is that our young people already have many of those capabilities. Our goal is to help heighten that and encourage creativity and not to deaden it in the process. The science centers are really active in that regard. We've talked a lot about the impact of science as a human experience. We've talked about science as it relates to your local communities and the societies around your science centers. But much of what we are dealing with, we're also dealing with truly on a global level. And in that regard, I'd like to turn to Emlyn Koster, who's the president and CEO of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in Raleigh, to talk a little bit about the ways in which we are raising public awareness and engagement in local and in global science-based issues. Emlyn?
Thank you, Bud, and good afternoon from Raleigh, North Carolina. Let me go to my first slide, please. I think one of the seeds that was sown more than half a century ago that got the Science Center movement happening was 3 years after the Second World War, when the then famous astronomer Sir Frederick Hoyle said the quote that I think is on my first slide, which we're going to momentarily, I hope. Bud, are you seeing that slide, or is it coming up now?
We are. It appears to be downloading. Here we are.
Okay, so we can go to that slide. That's the correct one now.
Mm-hmm.
And so this quote that was very prescient, that whenever it would happen 21 years later with Apollo to the moon, that a photograph of the Earth became available. As he said, once the sheer isolation of the Earth became plain, new ideas as powerful as any in history would be let loose. Let's go to the next slide. For me, this quote was anticipating a very pronounced change in the course of evolution of purpose of science centers and science museums. Prior to the late 60s, and I'm generalizing a little bit because interactivity was present in the Palais de Découverte in Paris and with the Berkeley Hall of Science and with the Seattle-based Pacific Science Center from the World's Fair in '62. But in essence, in '69, we have a bursting forward of a new kind of science museum that was less dependent on collections but more on scientific literacy for the new generation. Prior to that, and continuing as a purpose for many science museums, is the depiction of the industrial past and a celebration of the potential power of technology to advance the status and progress of society. What we have is a more reflective mood, in my view, that it can be approximately tied to the new millennium, the third generation kind of purpose of science museums, which, as it says at the top of this slide, is building on the premises of the previous two generations, but is shifting gears to be more about illuminating how science and technology are integral to our culture and future. The lens has gone from the past to the future. The next slide, please. To segue into the 21st century, I'll give you two quotes that I am powerfully moved by. One from a colleague, a physicist, who wrote this first quote in 1990 in a book called Planet Under Stress, where she was essentially anticipating what we would now call citizen science, that scientists and citizens ideally should be working together to solve our problems together. That's been a very progressive facet of the last decade or so. And the famous, the late Carl Sagan of Cosmos fame, who correctly anticipated now, what, 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, that he maintained that science is an absolutely essential tool for any society, not just the science engaged by the practitioners, but by science understood and embraced by the entire community. Let's move on. So this slide, which uses the term in the title Anthropocene, which may or may not be familiar to those who are clicking in this afternoon, that's a potential new term in the geologic timescale that is being actively discussed now by the International Union of Geologic Sciences, the worldwide authority on geology and earth science, that is considering that a case is to be made for adding or replacing actually the current name, Holocene, as in post-Ice Age, by Anthropocene, the epoch of the human influence since the Industrial Revolution. So vast has been the power and the influence and the tread of the human foot, if you will, on the natural world and the atmospheric world and the hydrospheric world. And so what you have on the left is the number of years over the last century or so that it's taken to shift human population another billion. The fact that we now have stabilized to the point of going to a new billion every 10 or so years hasn't lessened the challenges that we literally hold the future of the sustainable future of our planet in our hands. And this is where science museums and science centers come into play with an imperative that we should be proactive about driving societal innovation, informing it, talking about it, exhibiting it, programming about it, and also equally, in my view, not just society, but the stewardship, the responsible management of matters of the natural world, and ultimately earth and human affairs are intertwined. That also means for me not just lifelong learning, which was a term that seemed strangely new only 2 decades ago, that education doesn't stop at graduation, but as the NSF said a couple of years ago, it also should be learning that we carry at any one moment in its full depth of opportunity, in its full breadth of opportunity, as well as over time throughout our lifetime. Next one, please. Next slide. So it becomes then the responsibility, in my view, of each science center, and my colleagues who have spoken before, ranging from Bud's opening comments, have made clear that we've got to be relevant. That was the first word of three kind of core values of the ASDEC community. Well, what I think is often lacking from the dialogue within our own profession is that we've got to actually pinpoint which area or areas do we want to be relevant to. Relevance means relating to the matters at hand. We can't be generalists. We can't be encyclopedic. We've got to pick what are the particular needs of our local community and respond to those needs with the particular talents that our particular science center has. It was said in 1909 by a very prescient museologist, John Cotton Dana, in New Jersey. He said, learn what the community needs and fit the museum to those needs. So on this slide is simply a sampling of what could be the accent, the chosen emphasis of a given science center, and they're not mutually exclusive. Many of us on this teleconference this afternoon are doing several of these at the same time, and I'll leave you to just look at this list. It's a recipe book, and we can pick where we best belong, but we should be active and proactive in responding to the needs of our community in some particular way, because there are real issues out there. Behind each one of these line items is a real 21st century need, and we're not being accountable, in my view, if we don't make explicitly clear which one of these or some others that we are driving towards progress on. What difference are we trying to make? What's our so what? Next slide, please. And so this means that we should, as a profession of museums, science centers included, that we should see ourselves, as often we do not, which is that we are a sector that makes up society's composition, and here is an alphabetical listing of some dozen or so sectors. We may not see ourselves in science centers and science museums, or museums of any kind, I'm including zoos and aquaria in this. We need to see ourselves as unique contributor to the betterment of society and the environment, helping to rectify the challenges that we created for ourselves and pursuing the opportunities that lie ahead towards a more sustainable course. Each of these sectors that I list on this slide has been on its own evolutionary path, and museums should not be exempt from this evolution of their own sense of responsibility to deal with the matters at hand. The next slide, please. And so last week I had the privilege of delivering a talk called Building a Community Through Science as an opening speaker at the Asia Pacific Science Center Conference in Brunei. And my talk was the evolution of purpose of science centers to be more successful in being, as one of my colleagues said, an agent or a catalyst in the community that is essential to building a scientific literacy. And so it does require that we do, I think, these 5 things here, that we should, each of us, determine and declare and pursue which aspect of science our surrounding region needs most. Then we need to make clear what that is, to declare our external value and attract stakeholders and collaborators to it. We should be about emphasizing the process and questions of science. And here in North Carolina, it's common to define STEM not so much as its usual 4 disciplines, but standing for strategies to engage minds, which I happen to think is a more powerful encompassing metaphor and value of the acronym than sometimes the 4 subjects are, which by themselves are limited in their advancing potential if we don't go further than the 4 disciplines. We need to continuously deepen and broaden our expertise that responds to our chosen purpose, and we should, as we're doing this afternoon, integrate new insights, one from the other, across our field worldwide, and to share these innovations as our field does generously at conferences of ASDEC and its sister organizations around the world. I head towards my last 2 slides, I think, next. And so let me just complete this slide. There's a pictorial on this. Please go on and click the rest of the slide. Next one, go ahead. The animation is still on the slides. Go ahead, please. Go back. Go back 2, please. Okay, that slide is not coming up in full. Let me just explain that in the makeup of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, something got lost in translation here. The building is composed of the physical elements that you see in blue that, more importantly, ask and answer the questions that are in yellow. One building asks the question, what do we know, with a North Carolina, Southeast U.S. lens. The second building answers the question, how do we know what we know, with a global research lens. The Daily Planet, iconic theater in the middle, asks and answers the question, what is happening now, and off-site and online and out into the community, how can I participate in terms of citizen science? The next slide. And so at this museum, we're focused on trying to measure, and we have several major grants in application right now to do this, that for me, the museum's primary return on its investment is the number of minds of all ages and backgrounds that the museum's experiences can be shown to motivate along this impact funnel, from perhaps the minimum level of engagement, which would be curiosity, at least I want to come to this place, to that my interest has been piqued, that I have deeper and broader insights about this subject now, to the point where I'm motivated to actually behave differently, vote differently, purchase differently, and talk differently, and become a different kind of orientation as a citizen of a world that needs everybody and every organization to play its part. Next one. And so I end with the declaration. Some of the words got garbled in the translation here, but you can get the spelling of most of them. Just a month or so ago in Europe, in Belgium, was one of the triennial gatherings of the Science Center field. Many of us on this call were there. It was in the city of Mechelen, just north of Brussels. And these are the 7 points of the concluding declaration, which I'll just speak to in a few seconds each. This is my summary of those 7 paragraphs. The field is called upon over the next 3 years to be even more effective in its engagement with its local community, a point which I've emphasized in this presentation. Secondly, to build awareness of how science locally feeds globally. The term "glocal" is now very much in our field's lexicon. Thirdly, to be even more successful at attracting the attention of decision makers and the news media to what we're doing. Fourthly, to leverage our position, Bud spoke about this, as trusted resources, leverage the trust that we know we have. 5, to promote understanding of the boundary of the interplay and the complementarity of formal and informal learning, as they have come to be termed somewhat unfortunately, speaking more about 2 sides than the continuum over time and space. 6th, to bridge the public to the world of research. And 7th and lastly, to share our experiences to facilitate global progress. The growth of the Science Center network, as Brad showed it on the maps at the beginning, has not understandably been equal, but there's a great fervor within the profession to try and make that map of Science Center distribution around the world a more balanced one, to both have and have not, so-called developed, so-called developing, so-called underdeveloped countries. Bud, thanks very much.
Pamela, thank you. There's the idea of emphasizing our global reach obviously is an imperative for all of us as a field. I think you've heard throughout the presentations that this is not something that the Science Centers can necessarily do alone. We depend very heavily upon our partnerships to make us succeed in all the areas. I wanted at this point to turn quickly to Ron Bailey, who's the co-director of the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to say a few words about that particular Science Center's relationships with the corporate community. Ron?
Thanks, Bud. I'm also here with Jason Brown, our Director of Science and Education, who's going to join us this morning as well. While my first slide is coming up, I'll just say we are here in Pittsburgh grieving the loss of our Penguins last night to the New York Rangers in the NHL playoffs, Game 7, and if we seem a little dejected, well, you'll know why. But let me talk a little bit about our corporate connections, which for us, much of which falls under the umbrella of our Chevron Center for STEM Education and Career Development, which is our umbrella organization within the Science Center, under which many of our STEM-related activities are contained. Next slide. As Bryce had talked about Science Centers as the community anchor, I'd like to talk about the Science Center as the regional convener, in this case, of dialogue around STEM education. We think Science Centers occupy a unique niche in the community at the intersection of these four community segments. We deal often and regularly with formal education. We have great relationships with schools. We also, as a result, are working very directly with students. At the same time, we have relationships with a wide range of industry and corporations and science professionals. And then, obviously, welcoming through our doors every day families and parents and the broader community. And as a result of that unique location where we find ourselves, we think that we're well positioned then to convene regional dialogue on many issues. In this case, I want to focus in on dialogue around STEM. Next slide, please. So as we drew together the Chevron STEM Center, we wanted to, and knowing we were working with this wide range of stakeholders, we felt the need for a very clear and concise mission. And as you can see, it's quite focused. It's simply to inspire young people to consider and to pursue careers in STEM. This is an effort that is very clearly directed at encouraging young people to keep STEM opportunities, STEM fields on their radar as they grow up through school, move on into college, and so on. Next slide. In order to convene that discussion, we convened a STEM advisory group that represents those five stakeholder communities. And we have 35 members there that represent corporations and foundations in the region. Pre-K to 12 education, higher ed, and other organizations in the region that are focused on STEM and have STEM-related missions. We brought them all around the table, recognizing that we're all doing our part, but if we were to do it together and create some joint collaborative goals, we may have better success in moving the needle around STEM education and building that next generation workforce in our region. Next slide. So as we created the STEM Center to be the umbrella for these efforts, that's a set of the founding partners, major corporations in Pittsburgh that have come forward to sponsor us and to support us financially, but perhaps just as importantly, or more importantly, through the help and the support of their employees coming in as volunteers and working with us to deliver a wide variety of STEM programming. Core to our mission is the fact that we believe that inspiring young people to keep STEM on their radar is having the opportunity to rub elbows with other STEM professionals and hear the kind of exciting work they do. What is it that drives them to get up in the morning and go into work? What kind of exciting problems are they solving to create a better world? And then relate that to 12, 13, 14-year-old young people. What kind of math were you taking when you were in 7th grade? And how did you get interested in being a civil engineer? That sort of thing. These corporations understand that message very well and came on again, not only as financial partners, but very much as supporters with their employees and supporting the programming we do in so many ways. Next slide.
So this is, my name is Jason Brown. I'm the Director of Science and Education. And as Ron said, we believe that corporate partnership is not just about financial, being provided with financial money as well. So it's about engaging STEM professionals in our mission, and in doing so, advancing the missions of the corporate sponsors as well. So in creating the STEM Center, one of our first goals was to create this common definition for what STEM education is, and we came up with 4 parameters for that. Inquiry-based science and math education, an integrated curriculum, project-based group learning, and career awareness. And this 4th one, career awareness, is really a great opportunity for corporate engagement. It provides students with a context for their schoolwork, and it also gives them a reason for what they are learning. So when the content grows more difficult as they progress through these more and more difficult courses, having a vision for their desired outcome makes it more likely that they'll persevere rather than give up and choose an alternative, easier pathway. It also enables us as partners to give relevance to STEM in students' lives, which is really the key to full engagement. So as a convener, which is what we strive to be and act as, we are basically trying to act as a bridge between the students and this corporate community. So I'm going to give you some examples of some of the programs that we have here through the STEM Center. Next slide, please. SciTech Days is one of our biggest programs. As you can see, it reaches a total of about 6,000 students. It also engages partnerships with about 40 local corporations. It takes place twice a year for a week each, totaling 10 days. And essentially what happens is we have these representatives and acting STEM professionals come in and engage with students, and as Ron said, share with them about what they do in their job, how they got there, what the pathway was, what kind of students they were younger, and essentially try and build this bridge between where students are now and what their current career prospects are and what the possibilities are that lie ahead of them. Next slide, please. The Pittsburgh Regional Science and Engineering Fair, which is celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, is another great way that we engage a very large number of local STEM professionals, STEM and science professionals. We have over 500 judges come to judge the students' projects. This year we had nearly 1,100 students come in grades 6 through 12. We had over 70 corporate sponsors. And again, these sponsors took the form of both money as well as having professionals come and speak with and interact with the students about the validity of their projects and about the possibilities that lie ahead for them. Next slide, please. ChemFest, as you can see, over 4,000 students participate per year, and again, 25 corporate exhibitors. We believe, as you'll see in all of these slides, that the best way to inspire young students about science is to expose them to enthusiastic professionals who are working in STEM fields, providing role models for them. And as we heard earlier, people who don't know about engineering don't think about engineering. So the more we can expose them to people who are acting in these fields, the more likely they are to pursue them in their own futures. Next slide, please. Engineer the Future, 1,400 kids from local schools and 5,000 visitors. Over 600 corporate volunteers acting from STEM and science professions come in to help out with Engineer the Future. We have 50 exhibits, and the students are exposed to the various engineering fields that are out there to look at the specifics of it and to recognize that engineering can take the role of just about anything that involves advancing civilization. It doesn't have to be one particular area. So by exposing them to this variety of choices that they have, they can tie it in with something that already interests them and lead to a better future for themselves. Next slide. Last year was the first annual Energy Summit, and then we have another one scheduled for later this year. Another benefit of having good corporate partners is that we can expose students to the grand challenges that are going to face their generation. Last year we had 100 students. This year we're expanding it, and we offered hands-on workshops by corporate volunteers on the various aspects of the energy industry. So by exposing students to these grand challenges, we're also exposing them to people in industry who are working to solve them. These are big issues for students, and by seeing that there are people who are working to solve them and recognizing that there's a path for them to do it as well, it's another pathway to lead them into these very lucrative careers. Next slide, please. We also have quite a few girls programs. As you probably all know, girls are very underrepresented in the STEM fields. They make up over 50% of the workforce, but less than 1/4 of the STEM workforce. So our girls programs are designed to provide role models for the girls so that they can see that there are practicing professionals just like them in these fields. And the goal is to get them out there and see what's going on. For example, Tour Your Future, as you can see there, ties practicing professionals with these girls to take them to their workplace and show them what they do. One example of this involved a group of middle school girls going to the UPMC Brain Mapping Center and having their brains mapped by the woman who runs it. So again, seeing what they can accomplish if they choose to. There are a lot of benefits to this, both for, essentially it's a win-win for everyone. Sometimes people don't think about the benefit that comes to it for employees as well. But a 2011 Business Monthly article found that, and I'll quote it, employee volunteer programs which allow workers to participate in volunteer activities as part of their work life is shifting the definition of job satisfaction, including developing an employee's skill set while also providing opportunities to develop new skills, encouraging teamwork and improved networking and communications with the company, increasing employee recruitment and retention, particularly with younger workers, and increasing employee morale, loyalty, and overall productivity. So not only do the students benefit, the Science Center benefits, the corporation benefits, but the employees benefit as well. And I'll give it back to Ron.
Next slide. So I'll just summarize then. So why would corporations support science centers, and in this case particularly our Chevron STEM Center? Because it addresses a real long-term workforce development need that they understand quite well, and in that case is in some ways self-serving. It's a chance for them to tell their story, often an exciting story to an audience that is engaged, of students and public, talk about the work they're doing, the exciting research that's happening behind often closed doors. It engages their employees, as Jason pointed out, in volunteering, having that positive experience. It associates them with a very high-profile, community-based effort, which reflects very well on their companies. And it's a tangible way to engage with other community partners. Often we find corporations really interested in wanting to work with schools, but they're not sure how to find that open door. Where should they be making the connection? We're happy to help bring them together and make those connections. So thank you, Bud. I'll give it back.
Ron, thank you so much, and Jason. Well, it's great that we're identifying the ways in which science centers connect with their communities in productive areas related to STEM, and those corporate partnerships, like your Chevron partnership, and all the others that joined in that exercise, are really important. I'd like to turn to a little bit of a deeper discussion about the ways in which the science centers truly are everywhere in their community, and I wanted to turn to David Chesborough, who is the president and CEO of COSI. Located in Columbus, Ohio, to dip a little bit more deeply into that subject. David? Unmute. Unmute your mic. You need to unmute your mic, David.
Sorry about that technical difficulty.
There you go. You're all set.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So what I'll try to do here is quickly go through the fact that science centers are distributed along physical presence, outreach, and what COSI has done, along with some of our other colleagues, is reach out and bring in. We have, if you go to the first slide that I had, we certainly have talked a lot about big city anchors. We mentioned the fact that we need to have our first slide, that's the last slide that's up. We have our big city anchors, like the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry that was mentioned, and their ability to have large impact, not only in million-plus visitors, but also the teacher work that they've done. But you also have a lot of smaller centers distributed out in the communities. Ithaca Science Center is one, for example, that the community actually volunteered and built the center out of their own interests and connected it with Cornell University. And you have in the middle of upstate New York, the Wilds is another one in Adirondacks, that they have become the community centers for a lot of things that you've heard from our colleagues. I'll quickly just mention there's some distributed networks where some of our colleagues have actually encouraged, networked, or actually built alternative sites to their main downtown center. So globally, when you look at it, we're in over 45 countries, with some being building-centric, the buildings themselves being kind of the anchor, other being very community-centric, where it's more outreach. I'm going to quickly go through the aspects of these. Next slide, please. On the next slide, we talk about the fact that 85% of science centers have outreach. There's been some mention of outreach here. I'm going to give a little bit of focus through COSI. We reach 315 to 350,000 people electronically or physically. Physically tends to be with elementary schools, electronically tends to be with middle and high school. Add that to our on-site, and we interact with 400,000 schools and school students and teachers every year, which contributes to the 13 million plus that our Science Center community has in terms of the ability to impact schools directly. Next slide, please. And all of us have come about this a number of ways: school presence, community centers, that's our science spots, festivals. Some of our colleagues have actually brought festivals into the communities in addition to being at the festivals that the communities hold. Next slide, please. We are one of the leaders. We've actually mirrored some of the work that Liberty Science Center started, but interactive video conferencing, which might be unfamiliar to a lot of people. This is where we have university and hospital partnerships. Things like real-time surgery, a focus on careers. You have live interactions with professionals that meet not only the needs of the curriculum, but also give opportunities to interact with not just surgeons who have 8-year residencies behind them, but those in the surgical team who might have 2-year degrees that, again, inspire, like we've talked about before, the interest and inspiration for teens to consider the possibilities. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that we're known for at COSI, you can see that we're one of those big city anchors, but big enough that we actually moved to a center of science model where this is where we do the reach out and bring in. So next slide, please. So we, along with Boston and others, have recognized the ability to bring researchers into the Science Center. We have, as far as we know, the only embedded research labs that are actually operating out of the Science Center as their home base. And so we have practicing researchers who engage with the public and also give them an opportunity to have scientists connecting with the public in different ways. The researchers get the ability to do research at the scale that they could not have the equivalent anywhere else. Our public gets to work with the researchers, understand the research, understand what research is. Also within this context, we have many science students from the universities learning to communicate with the public. And we also, for example, have pharmacology doctoral candidates doing their clinicals at COSI because they found it's one of the best ways to equip them to be capable in their jobs of speaking with the public. And we drive all this out of a joint center for research and evaluation with the university. Next slide, please. We also, like the others, we bring science into the centers, and so that's something you see very much. I think many science centers have realized that those partners of universities, companies, and science-based entities, in this case it was Scott's Miracle-Gro and their researchers at NASA, give an opportunity for the kind of interactions that, again, make science center presence pervasive throughout the community. Next slide, please. Now, the other piece is the community hub. You've heard some discussions of this. We're blessed to have the only HD TV studio built in and integrated into a science center, which allows us to not only hold community conversations with outside experts and controversial issues, but also broadcast and record out of that. That's led us to have things like TEDx, Makers Fair. Those are things that our other colleagues have talked about as well. So the idea is that you either have a physical presence, you have an outreach presence, or like in our case, we also have a reach out and bring in presence that actually is part of our formal approach to giving you the, I hope, the idea that science centers, last slide please, that science centers might be anchored by their physical structure, but really are pervasive in so many different ways, physically, electronically, and outreach. So I think, again, the point here is that 95 million that we're talking about probably is a small number because we probably have a lot of interactions that we don't even count. So I'm going to turn things on to Joe, or back to you, Bud, so we can make sure Joe has some time.
David, thank you so much. I hope people can get the impression from David's points that an institution as strong as COSI is already a strong physical presence in its community, but the fact that it has built these connections throughout the community, not only to the scientists in the community, but to the community more broadly, is exactly what we hope to see happen in science centers everywhere. Throughout this discussion, we've talked about a variety of different communities that we try to reach. Unquestionably, the youth represent the community that is most important to us, and in that regard, I'd like to turn to Joe Haas who is the CEO of the Kentucky Science Center in Louisville, to talk a little bit about programs that are dealt with that we deal with that focus on launching new opportunities for youth. Joe?
Great. Thank you so much, Bud, and hello from Kentucky. Let me expand just a bit on the work of science centers globally to inspire, engage, and educate teens. Teens, as we know, are tomorrow's global and local leaders, and they're making critical choices today about staying in and being successful in school, and ultimately they are in parallel making pivotal decisions about future careers in STEM fields. A number of reports recently have reinforced, as we probably all well know, the importance of school readiness, also the interplay and the relationship between formal education channels and informal education experiences to students' success in school. What we know now is also how critical the massive amount of out-of-school time. Someone referenced this statistic. Students are spending an inordinate amount of time out of school. We're so worried about what's going on in school, but we know that where youth, particularly teens, choose to spend their time when they're not in school is also significant to their academic success. Like Bayer Corporation, you've heard reference today, Bayer Corporation regularly reports on the state of STEM education, science literacy in general, and America's workforce. That company and allegedly 98% of STEM-based companies that were reported inside that study know that STEM education is a national priority. You're all part of that movement. All of you online today with us are part of that movement to connect today's youth with tomorrow's job opportunities. We take that responsibility very, very seriously, and science centers globally can be a significant. We serve youth, and we not only serve youth in diverse ways, but we also serve them with a range of engagement strategies, and we serve youth in very large numbers. Over a recent 2-year period, Aztec institutions around the globe have engaged teens in more than 2 million hours of STEM-related youth development programming. 2 million hours of STEM-related programming in just 2 years. These programs hook teens, establish that STEM subjects are interesting and are relevant to them personally. They provide channels for exploring personal interests. They offer them peer networks and provide them encounters with STEM professionals that can ultimately spark their interests, as well as guide those teens toward college and career readiness in the STEM world. Girl Scouts recently published a report. I'm a female face in today's lineup, and I think it's important to acknowledge that girls in science is an important focus. What the Girl Scout report found is there's no surprise. You can throw those slides up there and move through them. They're just sort of visual backdrop for my remarks, so thank you. Girls, it's no surprise, girls love STEM, particularly at young ages, because STEM learning offers them creative and problem-solving opportunities. Girls love the idea of tackling problems and making the world a better place, and STEM gives them channels for doing that. Yet a gap does exist between STEM interests and career choices for girls, mostly because they lack a plethora of role models to see themselves as being successful in those careers. We know you need women in your STEM workforce, and we need to collectively focus on this opportunity. Science Center programs serving teen boys and girls are wide-ranging, and for this reason they span the gamut from high-volume, inspiration-oriented events that are designed, like the one you're seeing on screen now, capture a teen's attention, rockets in your lobby or on your street corner. Give teens the opportunity to have that valuable moment of awe and excitement, and give them chances to dabble and get involved on their own terms. There are other programs and events, and these are often programs, you've heard many of them referenced today, programs done in collaboration with corporate partners, with the universities, with associations who have STEM agendas in your local community or in your regional communities. These are deeply engaging programs. Many of them provide hands-on interaction with STEM professionals, real-world STEM tools and equipment and situations or activities that put teens right in the middle of a STEM workplace experience, if only for just a short time. And these experiences can provide exposure for students, that might be absent in their other contexts. Science centers are the conduit between employers and large numbers of teens, and these are the teens who will ultimately choose what career to pick and pursue, and we want them to pick STEM careers. Science centers also offer longer longitudinal opportunities. Teen programs are ubiquitous across science centers, and these programs allow teens to build passion for STEM and workplace skills. These vary. They can be apprenticeships, teen STEM clubs, and ongoing gathering opportunities for teens to develop passions and interests and cultivate them over time. So much of what you hear today is focused on test scores and STEM proficiency in school settings. A report by Robert Tye, I'll let you look up, but it basically reinforces that early interest in science is in fact a driver of ultimate career choices. So inspire students early on as middle school students and early in their high school years, and ultimately they have a higher propensity for picking STEM-related careers. You'll find that science centers are fantastic STEM inspiration partners. We have channels, we have audiences, our teams are expert at translating the STEM world in exciting and engaging ways. You have the real world experiences at your fingertips, and you have today's STEM professionals who are working for you, and together we can bring those assets to bear and ignite greater interest and increased impact in around this national STEM agenda. So thank you very much. Back to you, Bud.
Joe, thanks very much for those comments and the emphasis on the many diverse ways that we can serve youth, not only with different types of activities, but different educational strategies, ways of reaching them. That's exactly the point about what science centers are all about. So folks, just to wrap up, what you've heard today is a great deal about informal science learning. You've heard about science learning in this vast amount of time that young people have outside the classroom. We've also heard about the ways in which we in the informal science learning community have tied ourselves to the formal education agenda as well, to the next generation science standards and to the classroom more briefly, both at the level of the students and the level of the teacher. You've heard about the importance that we attach of science education to workforce development, and the fact that we realize that the inspiration factor is as important as anything else to driving a new generation toward an interest in science and an actual career in science down the road. You've heard a bit about the fact that this is not only about youth, but about lifelong learners, an issue that addresses young people, but it's an issue of science and public engagement throughout life. And that is true for those addressing issues on a local scale and on a global scale. And you've heard that we as science centers value our physical presence in the communities, but also our distributed engagement out into the communities more broadly. And finally, I think what you've heard is that we can't do it alone, that we do this in partnership with all of the other entities that are trying for the same goals to serve our STEM agenda, to help young people be engaged in science in their lives, and the many supporters who make this happen because they realize that it is in our economic and our social interests and in the interest of our quality of life. My final point is only to say that it is well studied that young people at an early age adopt exactly the same attributes that any scientist has. Any child will form a hypothesis, will look now to find a way to develop a theory about anything that they see in life. They'll test, they'll try ideas, they'll extrapolate from what they learn, and that is exactly what we would like to see in young people as they pursue science careers. Our job is to enhance that, not to deaden it over the course of their lives, and science centers are well placed to do that. I think we're at the end of our time period here. Ted, I'm going to turn it back to you. I don't know whether you handle questions, but we as a community would be delighted to receive any questions, thoughts, comments that will come in to you through STEMconnector, and we'd be delighted to follow up with anyone who has any additional thoughts on this. Ted?
Thanks so much, Bud, and thanks to everybody on the town hall today. I just don't say call anymore, on the Hangout. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Brian, my colleague Brian Jackson's here, just checking and seeing if we've had anything come in through social media. Materials, it doesn't look like we have, but the materials, you can actually automatically go back and watch this on YouTube at either the event site on Google+, or you can go to STEMconnector.org/town hall. If you just go to the STEM Connector page and there's a tab there for Town Hall, this will be the first one that will come up. All the presentations will be available, and one in particular, Emlyn's, I apologize, Emlyn, we tried to take it from PDF to PowerPoint, then to Google Slides, because that's the best medium, and we learned from this stuff. So Emlyn's will be available. We'll make them available in PDF for you so that you can download them and print them off if you'd like. We'd also like to invite all of the speakers today to put together a blog post for our STEM Daily, and perhaps even build upon this sort of holistic look of science centers as a community resource and as a resource for both formal and informal education. So I think Edie's coming around to say hi, and I think, Brian, are there any questions? So I'll turn it over to Edie to say goodbye, and thanks so much, Bud, and everyone.
We're blown away by the substance of all of the science centers, and it's so great as you've gone around the country. We've learned from each of you. We're going to encourage STEM Daily today. Already told everyone to go up and download the slides and listen to this great town hall, just as you are a cornerstone of STEM. So, Bud, to you and each of the science centers is we just applaud you. And this whole country should wake up to the work that the science centers are doing. So we're so grateful to tell the nation what you've said about youth and learning and your innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, everyone, take care, and we're just go head off the air.